People think power in relationships comes from control, but that's not true. Real power comes from awareness. And here's the problem. Most empaths don't even realize the game they're trapped in. They give and give and give, believing that one day the narcissist will change, but that day never comes. Because narcissists don't thrive on love. They thrive on control, attention, reaction, until something shifts. There comes a moment, rare but powerful, when the empath stops reacting, stops chasing, and starts seeing things clearly. And when that happens, the entire dynamic begins to break. The narcissist, who once seemed in control, starts losing their grip, not because they were overpowered, but because the empath finally understood the truth. So what is that one shift that changes everything? You have to understand something fundamental before anything else. This kind of relationship doesn't just happen by accident. It's not random, and it's certainly not meaningless. There's a pattern beneath it, something deeply rooted in human psychology that pulls two very different types of people toward each other. That on one side, you have the empath, someone who finds purpose in giving, in understanding, in trying to bring harmony into chaos. They don't just feel their own emotions, they feel the emotions of others, often to a degree that becomes overwhelming. And because of that, they develop this quiet belief that if they just give a little more, try a little harder, love a little deeper, they can fix what's broken. But on the other side, you have the narcissist. And the narcissist operates very differently. Their sense of self is unstable, often fragile, even if it doesn't appear that way on the surface. So they construct a reality where they must remain in control. They seek validation, attention, and emotional reactions, not necessarily because they enjoy connection, but because they depend on it to maintain their sense of identity. Now, here's where it becomes dangerous. The empath's desire to give meets the narcissist's need to take, and at first it feels like it works. The empath feels needed, the narcissist feels empowered. There's a kind of unspoken agreement forming. One gives meaning through sacrifice, the other gains stability through control. But the problem is, this isn't balance, it's dependency. And over time, that dependency becomes a loop. The more the empathic gives, the more the narcissist expects, the more the narcissist demands, the more the empathic tries to compensate. It becomes a cycle that feeds itself, slowly eroding one person while reinforcing the behavior of the other. And what makes it even more complicated is that the empath often believes they're doing the right thing. They believe patience will solve it, that kindness will transform it, that if they just endure long enough, something will change. But it doesn't. Because the structure of the relationship itself is the problem. It's built on imbalance, on unconscious roles that neither person fully understands, yet both continue to play. So you have to look at it honestly. Strip away the emotion, the hope, the illusion, because what you're dealing with is not simply a connection between two people. And once you begin to see that pattern clearly, something else starts to reveal itself, something most people misunderstand entirely, the idea of control. Because on the surface, it looks obvious. It looks like the narcissist is the one in charge. They set the tone, they shift the mood, they decide when there's closeness and when there's distance. They appear confident, certain, even dominant. And the empath, in contrast, seems reactive, adjusting, accommodating, trying to keep the peace, but that appearance is deceptive. The control you think you're seeing is not strength. It's dependence, carefully hidden behind behavior that looks powerful, because the narcissist's sense of control is not self-generated. It doesn't come from within. It relies completely on something external. It relies on you, on your attention, on your reactions, on your willingness to engage in the emotional dynamic they've created. Take that away even slightly, and something interesting begins to happen. The stability they project starts to crack. Not immediately, not dramatically, but subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. Because what fuels their sense of control is your participation in the pattern. Every time you explain yourself when you didn't need to, every time you chase clarity, every time you try to fix what they've disrupted, you are, without realizing it, reinforcing the very structure that keeps them in control. You're playing a role in a system that depends on your energy to survive. And here's the uncomfortable truth. As long as you keep playing that role, the illusion remains intact. It feels like they're powerful because you're constantly responding. It feels like they're in charge because you're constantly adjusting. But remove that response. even just a little, and the entire dynamic begins to shift, because control that depends on someone else is not real control. It's conditional, it's fragile, it's temporary, and that's why the narcissist works so hard, often unconsciously, to keep you engaged, whether through charm, conflict, confusion, or emotional. That intensity, the goal is the same: to pull you back into the cycle where your reactions continue to sustain their position. But once you begin to see this clearly, something changes in you. You stop interpreting their behavior as power, and you start recognizing it for what it really is, a system that only works if you keep feeding it. And that realization is uncomfortable at first, because it forces you to confront your own role in the dynamic, not as someone to blame, but as someone who has more influence than they thought. Because if your engagement sustains the system, then your withdrawal begins to dismantle it. And that's the moment where the illusion starts to break. And when you finally begin to understand that the control was never as solid as it appeared, you arrive at a moment that is both quiet and incredibly powerful. It's not dramatic. It's not loud. In fact, from the outside, it may not even look like anything has changed at all. But internally, something shifts, because the real turning point is not about what you do to the other person. It's about what you stop doing for them. You stop over-explaining yourself. You stop trying to be understood by someone who has shown you repeatedly that they are not interested in understanding. You stop chasing resolution in a system that thrives on keeping things unresolved. And that's not easy. In fact, it may be one of the most difficult things you ever do, because it requires you to confront a part of yourself that has been deeply conditioned to seek harmony at any cost. It asks you to step out of a role that once gave you a sense of purpose, the role of the fixer, the peacemaker, the one who holds everything together. But here's the problem with that role. It only works if you abandon yourself in the process. So this shift, this thing that changes everything, is not an act of aggression. It's not revenge. That E. It's not about becoming cold or indifferent in a destructive way. It's something much more precise than that. It's conscious detachment. It's the decision to remain present, but no longer emotionally entangled in the chaos, to observe without immediately reacting, to hear without automatically absorbing, to stand in your own position without needing constant validation from the other side. And when you begin to do that, consistently, something remarkable happens. The patterns that once defined the relationship start to lose their grip, because those patterns depended on your participation. They relied on your emotional investment, your willingness to engage, your instinct to repair what was never yours to fix. And without that, the entire structure becomes unstable. You may notice the other person trying to pull you back in, subtly at first, then more directly. They may test boundaries, provoke reactions, attempt to recreate the dynamic that once worked so effortlessly for them. But this time, something is different. You don't respond the same way. Not because you don't feel, but because you've learned that not every feeling requires a reaction. Not every situation demands your energy. Not every conflict deserves your involvement. And in that space, in that pause between stimulus and response, you begin to reclaim something that was slowly taken from you over time. Your clarity, your stability, your sense of self. Because when you stop negotiating your worth, when you stop bending to maintain something that was never balanced to begin with, you create a new reality. One where your presence is no longer defined by how much you can endure, but by how clearly you can see. And that's where the real shift happens, not in what you say, not in what you prove, but in what you no longer participate in. Because the moment you withdraw your energy from a system that depends on it is the moment that system begins to fall apart. And when that system begins to fall apart, the effects are not one-sided. Something very specific starts to happen on the other end of that dynamic, something that often catches people off guard. Because when you change your behavior, when you step out of the role you've been unconsciously playing, the other person is forced into unfamiliar territory. The responses they relied on, the patterns that once worked so predictably suddenly stop producing the same results, and that creates confusion. At first, it may be subtle, a slight shift in their tone, a moment of hesitation, an attempt to re-engage you in the old way, perhaps through charm or by revisiting familiar emotional triggers. It might even look like things are improving for a brief moment, but that's not transformation. That's adjustment, because what's really happening underneath is a loss of control, not in the dramatic sense, but in the structural sense. The framework that allowed them to predict and influence your reactions is no longer stable. And without that predictability, their position weakens. So they try again. They may increase their efforts, becoming more persuasive, more attentive, or in some cases, more provocative. They might push harder, testing to see if they can bring you back into the cycle. Because from their perspective, the previous dynamic wasn't just comfortable, it was necessary. It gave them a sense of certainty, and now that certainty is gone. What once worked no longer works, and that realization creates pressure. Not necessarily the kind of pressure that leads to growth, but the kind that exposes underlying instability. Because without your consistent reactions, without your emotional engagement, they are left with something they've likely avoided for a long time, themselves. And that's where things become unpredictable. Some may attempt to regain control by escalating behavior, seeking stronger reactions, trying different strategies, pushing boundaries that were once easily crossed. Others may withdraw, confused by the sudden lack of feedback they once depended on. But in either case, the pattern has been disrupted, and here's the critical part. This shift is not something you force. It's not something you impose on them. It happens naturally as a consequence of your change, because the dynamic was never sustained by one person alone. It required both roles to remain intact. And now one of those roles is gone. You're no longer responding in the same way. You're no longer reinforcing the same behaviors. You're no longer providing the consistency that allowed them to operate without question. And without that, the entire interaction begins to lose its structure. What you start to see, often for the first time, is that what appeared to be strength was heavily dependent on your participation. And once that participation is removed, even partially, the imbalance becomes visible. Not because they've suddenly changed, but because you have. And that's what makes this stage so important. Because it reveals something fundamental. The dynamic was never as fixed as it felt. It was maintained, reinforced, and sustained through patterns that can, in fact, be broken. And once those patterns are broken, what once seemed stable begins to unravel. And when that unraveling begins, you're left standing in a place that feels unfamiliar, but also in a strange way, grounded. Because for the first time, the focus is no longer on fixing the other person, managing their behavior, or trying to stabilize something that was never stable to begin with. The focus shifts back to you. And that shift is where real power begins to emerge. Not the kind of power that dominates or controls. Something far more difficult to attain. Self-mastery. Because it's one thing to recognize a pattern. It's another thing entirely to stop participating in it. Especially when every instinct you've developed over time is pulling you back into the familiar. The urge to respond, to explain, to smooth things over. It doesn't just disappear overnight. You feel it, you notice the tension. The silence that replaces chaos can feel uncomfortable at first, almost as if something is missing. And in a way, something is the constant emotional engagement that once defined the relationship is no longer there. But what replaces it is far more valuable. Clarity. You begin to see situations as they are, not as you hope they would be. You stop interpreting behavior through the lens of potential and start recognizing it through the lens of reality. And that alone changes the way you move, the way you respond, the way you decide what deserves your energy. Because now your actions are no longer driven by emotional urgency. They're guided by awareness, and awareness creates space. Space between what happens and how you respond. Space to choose whether something is worth engaging with or simply observing and letting pass. Space to maintain your position without feeling the need to defend it at every turn. That's not weakness. That's discipline. And over time, that discipline becomes stability. You're no longer easily pulled into conflict. You're no longer dependent on external validation to feel secure. You're no longer negotiating your sense of self based on how someone else behaves. You become consistent. And consistency is something that cannot be easily manipulated, because manipulation depends on unpredictability, on emotional reactions that can be triggered, redirected, and used. But when your responses are grounded, measured, and intentional, that unpredictability disappears. You're no longer reacting, you're choosing, and that changes everything. Because at that point, the dynamic that once defined a relationship loses its influence entirely. Not because the other person has transformed, but because you are no longer available in the same way. You're no longer accessible through the same emotional channels that once kept you engaged. You've stepped out of a cycle. And what replaces it is a quiet kind of strength. Not something that needs to be announced or proven, but something that is felt in the way you carry yourself, in the way you hold your boundaries, in the way you no longer feel compelled to explain your worth to anyone. Because you understand something now that you didn't before, that your value was never something to be negotiated. Your presence was never something to be earned through sacrifice. And your stability was never meant to depend on someone else's approval. And once that understanding settles in, truly settles in, there's a freedom that comes with it, a kind of independence that isn't loud or dramatic, but steady and undeniable. Because the moment you realize you can walk away, not out of anger, not out of fear, but out of clarity, is the moment you are no longer controlled.